Horror Convos, come on in, have a seat, stay a while, take a load of vibe into the beat. We can just chill, have a drink, say what's on our mind. Never know what you're thinking, hey, it could be neat. Fear is everywhere, in your mind, on the street, in the earth, in the stars. Scary things you left for free. What you gotta say about it? Having fun, you and me. If you got nowhere to go, no place to be, just relax, have a chat, but don't think it's therapy. If you get too afraid, there's a door you can leave. Good night and be well, maybe talk again. We'll see. Good night and be well. Maybe talk again. We'll see. You can night be well. Maybe talk again. We'll see.
Happy New Year, everyone. This intro is being recorded just after the countdown finished. The last year of the first half of the 2020s is upon us. The ball is dropped, and I am officially up to 3. Get used to it, because one of my resolutions is to make this show more entertaining for you and for me, no matter the personal embarrassment on my part.
Dignity? What's that?
Welcome to the beginning of Season 2 of Horror Convos, a casual, relaxing, and occasionally funny podcast where we choose one horror topic per episode and discuss anything related to it that we want. Movies, TV, novels, comics, video games, radio dramas, personal experiences, nothing is off limits here. I often have guests join as we share our opinions and compare examples that portray the subject. New episodes release every other Wednesday, and you can look forward to new content being released alongside our standard episodes this year. What will it be? That's a surprise. Horror Convos is available to listen to on YouTube and Spotify. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and come hang out at the Horror Convos Facebook page to share your thoughts and leave suggestions. If you worry about being slowly indoctrinated by innocent-looking commercials from corrupt megalomaniacs playing God with illegal bioagents under the guise of a global pharmaceutical giant, you can listen to this show ad-free at patreon.com/horrorconvos. Tier 1 membership gets you commercial-free podcasts along with exclusive content like outtakes that didn't make it into the episodes. Tier 2 membership will get you access to vote on what we discuss in special event episodes. We appreciate everyone who donates to help our little podcast grow. That's patreon.com/horrorconvos. If you like what we do and want to be notified the moment our newest stuff is uploaded, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. We have a special 2-part episode to start off this new season. This last podcast I recorded was one of the most fun discussions I've had. We ended up talking for so long that I didn't want to risk some people not listening to the whole thing. You know, not everyone wants to listen to me and a guest talk for over 3 hours straight. So today's podcast will be part 1 for this topic. The next half will release on Wednesday, January 15th, 2 weeks from today. With all that out of the way, we can get to what you read in the title. We are once again discussing a specific horror franchise. I have talked about this particular one before, but this is the first episode focused around it.
Resident Evil.
And returning for this conversation is my friend who's been on this show a couple of times now. If you want to hear more from him, he was also recently a guest on the VHS Doom podcast. It's the host of which I also had on the episode before this. I'll link his episode on VHS Doom in the video's description. Please welcome back, Alfonso. I've talked before on the podcast with Melissa about what got me into Resident Evil, like the very little exposure I had to the games growing up. I was big into the movies for a while. Like I went with my dad to see almost all of them in theaters. Because I don't remember which ones that we didn't see in theaters exactly. Yeah, but I owned all of them on DVD. Every time the next one came out, it was like I had to have it. By the time it got to the 4th one, I was really starting to that was the last movie that I remember seeing in 3D. Like, I cannot stand 3D movies anymore. They give me a headache anytime I put those glasses on and then take them off. It's like anytime a new movie is advertised, and it's like, you remember when everything had to be 3D. That's the big marketing hook. Like, as a kid, that would have had my attention. As an adult, that just automatically makes me roll my eyes these days. It's yeah, honestly, I don't remember the last time a movie was advertised with a 3D as the marketing gimmick. Like, I kind of think that went out of style after the 2010s.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, the last 3D movie I remember seeing that I actually enjoyed was probably Spy Kids 3. Game Over. And that one, that was the last movie I saw where I thought to myself, yeah, this had to be 3D. Like, it wouldn't have worked so well if it wasn't. But then with Resident Evil Afterlife, I'm like, this is cool, but you really didn't need to do this for this. But anyway, but by the time it got to the fourth one, I was starting to realize, oh my god, they're running out of ideas. They really don't know what they're doing with this. The first three, it at least felt like they had some kind of vision for where they were going with it. And then by the time we get to the fifth and God, the last one, the sixth one, I'm just like, I watched those purely out of curiosity. I think the fifth one was the last one I saw in theaters. And even that one, my dad and I both walked out of just like, what the hell are they even doing now? And the most tragic thing of all, I don't remember the name. It's like I tried to get my research ready for this, but some names and dates I missed. Someone died, I believe, during production of the final chapter. It was like a stunt person that I think got killed with something relating to, I think it was the train scene, the sequence where Alice and Dr. Isaacs are fighting each other on top of that caravan or something with those human prisoners inside. It's one of Dr. Isaac's clones, the religious zealot. And I think someone got killed during filming of that sequence.
No, yeah. As far as I understand it, with the production of the final chapter with the Resident Evil 6, is you are correct. A stunt person they died on set. When they were filming in South Africa, I think, yeah, with one of the Army Humvees that they used for the filming. Another thing is there was a stunt woman that also lost her livelihood because of that film as well. She suffered a serious injury, so that was another component of the troubled production behind it.
I can only imagine how the person holding the gun, whoever it was that killed Brandon Lee, must have felt. I'll tell you, it's always just kind of like I said, just it leaves kind of a permanent scar on the legacy of whatever production it is, as whether it's film or a stage play. I mean, it's like Phantom of the Opera is such an enduring story for a reason, and because it really plays into that anxiety of how tragedies behind the scenes can really imprint themselves onto the art. And I, with all due respect to the stunt person who died in the final chapter, it's like I use the term art very loosely when describing that movie, because it's just I have such a love-hate relationship with the Resident Evil live action franchise, really the movies in general, including the computer animated films, because people have gone up and down. It's like debating for so many years now, really for decades at this point, ever since the idea of a Resident Evil movie became a reality. Because there was a time when nobody would have believed you could make a movie out of a game like that to begin with. The history of what it took to get the first film made alone, it's such a wild and just weird ride. Just the decisions that were made behind the scenes, and there's still so much that we don't know about the history of what went on in the discussions to get the first film made. It's like there's scripts that were talked about that we'll never get to see. There's behind the scenes conferences and discussions between Capcom, Sony, and Constantine. I mean, not the DC character, the company that first purchased the rights to make a Resident Evil film. That's the studio logo I think people most closely associate with the movies is Constantine. It's one of those things where it's like the making of Jaws, where the history of making the thing is almost a more interesting story than the work of fiction itself. It's like, if I've said before, it's like I would love to see a based on true events comedic drama about the history of Jaws getting made. They're doing that exact story now, I believe, as a stage play. So that would be very interesting to see. But I always thought that would make such an interesting movie too, not as a documentary, but as like a lot like what they did with that movie The Big Short with Steve Carell, Christian Bale, Brad Pitt. It's like it's more of a comedy than a drama, but it's based on the events that came about for the 2008 stock market crash. It's like that's become one of my favorite movies, and it's like every time I would watch it, I'd think to myself, God, this would, if they did like a based on true events movie about the making of Jaws in the exact style that they did this movie, The Big Short, that movie would make so much money. It would become a bestseller guaranteed. But yeah, I would love to see a documentary about the history of getting the Resident Evil films made. The George Romero version alone, is such a fascinating topic when discussing the Resident Evil franchise as a whole. Well, because Romero's name is really all over this series from the beginning, with how he influenced the concepts that would go into the game, and then of course directing the live action commercial for Resident Evil 2. That's the closest we got to what his vision for an RE movie would have been. And he went through like 6 different drafts of trying to write a script for what the first actual film would have been. But for whatever reason, Capcom, Sony, and Constantine turned it down after those 6 drafts, and it's just there's so many points in this historical period where I would have just loved to have been a fly on the wall.
I know, right? I mean, it's just like a great what if when it comes to a lot of these sequels in franchises. Just like I mean, it's kind of unrelated, but Peter Jackson was considered at one point to direct A Nightmare on Elm Street 6. That would have been an interesting take, I think, that they were considering bringing him on. And I think he had ideas of what he wanted to do with that film and with Freddy Krueger. It's and kind of also with Halloween 5, Halloween 6, they were thinking of Quentin Tarantino to direct that sequel. So it's just like, but no, George Romero with Resident Evil. I mean that would have made so much sense.
Pardon the pun, that I'm sure has been done to death, but it really seems like a no-brainer, doesn't it? The first Resident Evil, so much of that game is literally just a blend of Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead, in terms of the concepts that Shinji Mikami worked into that at the conceptual stage. I mean, for a lot of people, for whoever's listening to this that doesn't know pretty much all the trivia about Resident Evil at this point, like the first game was an unofficial remake or spiritual successor to a Japanese game, Sweet Home, which in some aspects was itself a predecessor to concepts that would later be used for Alone in the Dark, which that game would then serve as influence for Resident Evil in terms of several of the gameplay mechanics, like the fixed camera angles, pre-designed backgrounds. So I mean, there's really the first Resident Evil is really a culmination of almost like 3 different games that came together into basically, if you consider Sweet Home a proof of concept and Alone in the Dark the evolution of those concepts, then Resident Evil, the original, was really the end result of all those ideas being polished out as much as they could be for both the creative vision and the technological allowances of the time. And the more you look at those three games specifically, and you could watch playthroughs of them on YouTube back to back to back, you really get a sense of how they are essentially one game, or the one core vision, then gradually expanding and evolving into something bigger than any of them could have been individually. They not had any of them not had influence from the other in a sequential order. But and Sweet Home, I think, was actually based off of a movie. I always get the history of that one mixed up. The movie was either based on the game or the game was based on the movie. But if you watch the movie, it's pretty much Resident Evil, just without Umbrella and the STARS members. The first Resident Evil is really a mix of two core influences. You've got the haunted house walkthrough, surviving the haunted house full of monsters. That came primarily from Sweet Home. And then you've got, the Living Dead, the more American, or specifically a Japanese perception of American Hollywood monster culture, like B-movie monsters, zombies, giant spiders, giant plants, Little Shop of Horrors, mutant sharks. I assume there was some influence from Jaws in there after the success of Jaws. If you're going to make a horror game, especially, a pioneer of a new genre of horror game, survival horror, then there's no way you're not going to work a killer shark in there somewhere. It's like, Spencer Mansion is pretty much like every human fear you could possibly imagine, every kind of monster you could imagine almost. It's like every corporeal horror just thrown in a blender, and you're pretty much just going through this fun house of, okay, what's behind door number 3? Is it a zombie, giant spider, man-eating plant? Like, let's have it, baby. Hey, what's that slow opening door gonna show next? It's like, it really is just like the world's worst game show, where it's like, good God, do I want to know what the prize behind the next door is? Like, can I just go home already?
Mutant shark doo 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 doo, mutant shark doo 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 doo, mutant.
No, we are not resorting to that.
So my kind of introduction was through the movies. I remember when I was growing up, the first movie, with Mia Jovovich playing the main female lead, of course, the protagonist for the rest of the series. But I remember. No, I would save that for Jill Valentine in the games. In the first one, yeah, either one.
No shame in saying that.
No. But also, since I'm a fan of the zombie subgenre, that is another thing what drew me into the Resident Evil franchise.
Ghouls.
I will say, now that I'm older, what was another compelling component for me is the Umbrella Corporation, this mysterious organization, and obviously overarching antagonists like Spencer.
I believe that's a core component to why the Resident Evil franchise remains so popular, so entertaining, and why the lore of it is so persistently, I don't know if I would necessarily say relevant. In some ways definitely relevant in a post 2020 world, but it's just Umbrella is one of the greatest archetypal overarching antagonists in gaming. It's like they're the Bowser of horror games. Seems in that they keep coming back no matter how many times you seem to kill them. If it's not Umbrella, then it's some new reboot of it, or a new company that's basically doing the same shit. They're just a different name. And now we've got the Connections, which are apparently like some new rival to Umbrella. It's like it's pretty much all the same different flavors of the man bad, corporate greed, science gone wrong, our scientists playing God. It's literally the same appeal as InGen in Jurassic Park. If you just substitute zombies for dinosaurs, there's always been that deep-seated institutional distrust of not just pharmaceutical companies, but really just the government, the military, corporate America, corporate greed especially. Yeah, but that's interesting that you got into the series through the movies before the game. Seems that because like 90-something% of the time it's the other way around.
I've only seen walkthroughs. I'm not a big gamer. I love watching walkthroughs and cutscene video games, films, I guess, to get the idea of the overall story and plot. So that's. But I do love games for the animation and the stories it has to tell that you don't really see in films because it's difficult. It is difficult to do a film adaptation from a video game, let alone from a book. I would say. I think there's some challenges there.
I would say it depends on the source material. Like some games, I would argue are like stupidly easy to make a quality adaptation out of. And it really astounds me in certain cases how with certain IPs how they've struggled so consistently with making a good adaptation out of them. But I won't name names because that's a whole other discussion. But
I think it also depends on the reason why I think that is because it depends on who is wanting to adapt that source material into a film or live action series, because I think that's what's going to be the key to success, depending on what their ideas are going to be
and their motives as far as like why do they want to adapt it, or what exactly is their vision for the direction of it. Like if you manage to make a franchise out of it, that's one thing that is very both intriguing and confusing about what exactly Capcom wanted out of the Resident Evil movies. But I'll get into that in a minute. So as far as the films go, if you had to pick a top favorite, which is your most favorite and which is your least favorite?
I'd say my most favorite,
not just the live action ones, but the animated ones too, if you want to include those.
I'd say my most favorite would be. I was pretty okay with Resident Evil Damnation, the 2012 animated film. Least favorite? Oh, gosh. Let's see. I want to say either Retribution or Afterlife. I'm kind of torn right there.
Really?
I think
it's like I thought for sure you were going to say the final chapter on one of those.
No. That's another one in the running. I think it's very difficult because the final chapter. I'll probably talk about this later, but there were some good ideas out of that. It's just the poor execution of the series, the lack of continuity, and where Paul W. Sanderson went wrong as the series progressed and the ideas they had. But I would say, yeah, the final chapter kind of, in some ways, kind of felt like a cop-out. And really, if you compare it to the first film, the 2002 film, the original, you can nitpick where they did so many retcons and where a lot of things don't add up by the time of final chapter.
kind of like Umbrella being retconned into a Japanese company when they were so clearly not It's like
Yeah.
Japanese source, just in the first movie.
Exactly.
They were a global conglomerate in the first film, I believe, as far as how they explained the company. I don't think they were one country specifically. I thought that they were like made up of. I it has been so long since I watched through all of those movies. Like I tried, I considered rewatching them, all of them in a row for this episode, and I don't know what it is. I consistently fall asleep trying to pay attention to them now. Like I cannot get into the movies anymore. Even the ones that I used to like the first three, which I still would consider to be the best ones, since I can't get through them anymore. Or it's like I always end up falling asleep by the time I get to one or two films into it. And I don't know why, because one thing I will say about these movies, like if I have to praise them for something, I would never call them dull or mundane. And it's like if you had to pick a film franchise for someone with ADHD, you could do a lot worse than the Resident Evil movies, because like these movies are bonkers. They almost always have something going on. There are parts of them that I guess could bore you if you're not into the whole corporate espionage angle, and big pharma, corporate America, all that crap. But it's in terms of like consistently keeping something going on, and with the characters, the environments, and the monsters, the action. I mean, this series is one of the most action heavy ever made. I would argue, even by the standards of the time that these movies were being made in, the 2000s onward. It's everything these movies do, for better and worse, and there's plenty of worse that we'll get to, is drenched, just like dripping, soaked to the brim in action, drama, stylization. It just there's nothing in these movies that I would say is down to earth, put it that way. I don't know what it is. I've just completely fallen out of love with them. And if I had to guess, it's a combination of my standards of what appeals to me in media changing as I've gotten older, or like compared to when I was a kid. It's a combination of that and me knowing where these films go as far as where the story ended up concluding. And it's the same reason why I can only watch episodes 1 through 6 of Star Wars, and I have to just pretend that the sequels never happened. And because if I watch anything past Return of the Jedi, then it's just I become apathetic. I would become apathetic towards the whole saga, knowing where it goes past that point. So for the sake of wanting to not lose my love of Star Wars altogether, like my capacity to enjoy it, I have to pretend and that nothing after Return of the Jedi happened. And even in the EU, I just, like, in my mind, there's no Thrawn trilogy, there's no Emperor coming back. There is nothing after Return of the Jedi.
Wow, I think some diehard Star Wars fans would find that blasphemous. That even the EU doesn't satisfy you.
Even the old EU, I would argue that the story was better left just cutting it at Return of the Jedi. Like I love the idea of Luke and friends having more adventures as much as the next guy. But in my personal opinion, none of the post Return of the Jedi stories, even the Thrawn related stuff, were worth where they went with the mythology beyond that point. I love Luke being married to Mara Jade. Like, it sucks that we never got that adapted into the films, because it's like I'm a hopeless romantic. I love the idea of Luke finding someone to love, getting a happy ending and all that, and having a family, and the solo children and all that. But ultimately, I just think if I had to pick a perfect ending for Star Wars, there's just nothing that beats the finale to Return of the Jedi. It's like everything that comes close to a worthy endpoint beyond that in the EU, there's always something, just every time there's something that just kind of bugs me and makes me go back to Return of the Jedi as the ideal endpoint. But that's just me. I mean, to be fair, I was never an avid EU fan to begin with. Like, I never got that deep into Star Wars to where I read every shred of books, comics, and played all the games and all that. I want to get into the history of at least the first film before we really get into the nitty gritty of this. So I don't know how much of this you knew. This is just I'll link in the description my sources. There are so many retrospectives and YouTube documentaries chronicling the history of the Resident Evil movies. I'll link one specifically. I think it's a Resident Evil Anatomy of a Franchise or something. I think it's an hour and 37 minutes. And if you want just a purely analytical deep dive into the history of these movies and as far as casting, production, development, and the series of Resident Evil films that we almost got that never saw the light of day, compare that to your history of unmade Halloween movies. These like I said, it's just a roller coaster, almost more interesting than the works of fiction. And so from what I found, and feel free to look at the retrospective I looked at or look at some other ones and just feel free to fact check me on anything, people listening, and because I only know what I was able to read, and there's unfortunately a lot of conflicting information and just lost information, lost to time on a lot of this stuff.
Uh-oh.
Incoming rant.
Alert.
Incoming rant.
Alert, class.
So in 1997, what happened is Constantine purchased the rights to make a Resident Evil film. And this was back when only the first game existed, because like 97, this was before RE2 came out. And the movie was set at one point to be written by Alan McElroy, if that's how you pronounce his name. That this is the guy who wrote the infamous live-action Spawn film from 97, and starring, I believe it was Michael Jai White. And I'm one of those people who think that Spawn deserves a comeback in terms of trying to make a film adaptation out of it, because that is a character that is slept on way too much in the list of comics that would make for a badass film treatment. And to if you're one of those people who loves dark superheroes that Blade or Ghost Rider, or you gotta watch the Spawn HBO cartoon or go back and read the comics. Do not judge that character or anything related to him based on the 97 film, because I'm telling you, you are missing out. Because Spawn is a wild character. And that's coming from someone who was not an avid comic reader growing up. I will be fully transparent on what a casual I am when it comes to a lot of comics. I just couldn't afford to, collect and read consistently growing up. But, you're talking so much money that would have been spent for me to really get deep into all the big ones. And because there were just no comic shops around when I was growing up that sold them. I didn't even know where to look for them. So coming from someone like me, even I knew what a badass Spawn was. So that should tell you something. But so you cut to June 1997, and PlayStation Magazine wrote an article reviewing what it claimed was the Resident Evil film's then leaked working script. And there's no proof, to my knowledge, that this script actually existed, or if it did, that this is actually the stuff that was in it. It's because some of this information, I'm citing from the retrospective that I looked at. I'm sure this isn't the only one that talks about this, but what you have to understand is PlayStation Magazine at this point was an independent, non-official publication, and had only been going for 10 issues at this point. So they were published by a young company named Future which was also publishing Nintendo Power. It wasn't until later that Sony would partially buy out PSM, claim partial ownership and rebrand it into PlayStation Official Magazine. And that's a whole separate era, a different magazine altogether. And what's interesting is this was at a point where gaming journalism was still very new. So they didn't have legislated, officially regulated standards of ethics to hold this field together. This wasn't like regulating journalistic integrity for newspapers. There's however much integrity they had. So this was really kind of the Wild West for gaming journalism back then. So this article comes out June 97, claiming that several scenes from the upcoming movie in this version of it would be directly recreated from the game, including the head turn of the first zombie, a fight with the giant spiders, a whole bunch of iconic moments from the game. But as far back as the first script, there seems to be a consistent pattern here that the story was going to strongly diverge from the game in other ways, in terms of characters' roles, how the plot was set up. They also mentioned that Jill's sex appeal was going to be played up much more for the movie than it was in the game. This is a direct quote from this article. And what RE movie would be complete without a Jill Valentine shower scene? Which, if you watch the first movie, lo and behold, that's how we're introduced to Alice, waking up with amnesia, naked in the shower, scantily covered by that shower curtain with the tasteful nudity as much as like the MPAA would allow for 2002.
Oh, that's hot.
Yeah, you notice in the first three films, especially, well, I would argue the first two more than all the others, those movies were really sold on the back of Mila Jovovich's body. She was very much a sex symbol for the majority of the first two movies. Thankfully they moved away from that, gave her a little bit more agency and substance by the third movie onward. Or, not that she had no character whatsoever in the first two, but admittedly, in the first movie especially, she's barely a character in that movie. She's very much kind of the audience character who's there to look pretty, listen to other characters explain what's going on, and kick a lot of ass. And to her credit, she is a legitimate badass in terms of how she prepared for these movies. She had a background all the way going back to her childhood in martial arts. She took taekwondo, karate, kickboxing. She studied dance, which helped I imagine, with her stunt work for the acrobatics and wire work. And she was trained in military hand-to-hand combat as well. She did a ton of training with guns and proper gun etiquette as far as how to hold and load one. And she did days to weeks to months for some of the movies of rehearsal for the gun work and wire work and stuff. If she branched out into learning wushu and Brazilian jiu-jitsu in later years, which I think jiu-jitsu is what she specializes in today, just in her personal life. So on the list of actors who can actually fight, she's the real deal. She did most of her own stunts in the Resident Evil movies, especially the first one, as many as her management would allow. I know I'm rambling. I'm trying to go through the history of this as quickly as I can. So later that same year, 97, George Romero, who's just come off of directing he hadn't done it yet, but he's known for having directed RE2's live action commercial, which Shinji Mikami specifically requested he do, which makes sense. You consider George Romero's influence on inspiring what Resident Evil would become. So Romero was at a low point in his career at this time because he had done Monkey Shines and The Dark Half in the 80s and 90s, which pretty much failed at the box office. They'd get cult followings in later years. But Romero was praised for his attention to detail by his colleagues for how much he worked for the Resident Evil commercial. Like Adrienne Frantz, who played Claire Redfield in the live action Ed, she's quoted saying every little detail counted to him. I remember he taught me how to pump a shotgun correctly. So his script would have taken a lot of elements from McElroy's, followed a lot of the same beats, and incorporated more of the over-the-top elements from the game, like, again, mutant shark, man-eating plants, giant snake, etc. And Romero, at this point, actually had no experience playing video games like this. Like, he wasn't a gamer. So what he did was he hired an assistant to play the first game extensively and regularly report back what he was seeing so that Romero could see how he could maybe adapt it into the script as it was being developed. So he was learning about the game as he was writing a script treatment for it. He even had concept art, which is publicly available. You can look it up, done by Bernie Wrightson, the same artist who co-created DC's Swamp Thing and drew the comics featured in 1982's Creepshow. He didn't draw the original Creepshow comics, I don't think, but he drew the ones that were featured in that movie. Romero really put his nose to the grindstone with trying to make the best, most authentic film adaptation of Resident Evil that he could. And this is a big reason why people were so disappointed that we never got to see any of what his vision for it might have looked like. It's like there's nothing put to film, even in test footage, before Paul W.S. Anderson.
Why?
Apparently what happened was, as far as this is all we know, really, and even a lot of this is conjecture, apparently Capcom, Sony, and Constantine just weren't looking to faithfully translate the games onto film in the first place. So, like, they fundamentally just disagreed with the idea of a faithful adaptation, because they wanted to make Resident Evil into a multimedia franchise with these movies not being beholden to the source material. Well, quoting a head Capcom producer, he basically said roughly, Romero's script wasn't good, so Romero was fired. And apparently Romero was really hurt by this because he considered Resident Evil to have largely ripped off his ideas that he did in his zombie films, which he kind of had a point. Watch the Living Dead films back to back with Resident Evil. It's basically Night and Dawn of the Dead thrown into a blender if you made it into a video game. But at one point they considered making the movie a canonical prequel setting up the first game's events, which is interesting because Resident Evil 0 came out the same year as the first movie, and it is a canonical prequel. So it's just, you got to wonder, if any elements of that idea for the movie ended up making their way into what the Resident Evil 0 game ended up as. I don't know. I really don't know if there was any behind-the-scenes overlap there.
Coincidence? I think not!
The zombie dogs were played by actual trained dogs, who the staff reportedly struggled to keep in makeup for so long because the dogs kept trying to eat it. It was like edible makeup, but there were definitely some ethical concerns, or there would be by today's standards, judging, some of the stuff they did with animals on set for the movie. But I'm personally glad they at least used real dogs in the first two films, compared to when they became CGI 100% of the time. Because the real zombie dogs to me were like the best recreation of a monster from the games. I don't know if you have a favorite monster as far as how they adapted the creatures from the games into live action.
The Licker, I thought the Licker was okay. The Tyrant, not that much. I think the Tyrants in especially Retribution look more like something out of Silent Hill, in my opinion.
Were there Tyrants in Retribution? I only remember Dr. Isaacs turning into one in Extinction.
In the New York Times Square sequence, those, I think that's what those two biohazards were when they were confronting Alice and Ada Wong in that sequence.
Is this when they were
But
in the Moscow replica
in New York City in that Times Square? But I think Dr. Isaacs in Extinction, like you said, was supposed to be a tyrant, which didn't look nothing like the one from the video game with the hat and the.
I think they were dressing him up to look more like a recreation of the tyrant from the original game. Yeah, Nemesis and Dr. Isaacs are the only tyrants I can remember off the top of my head. Maybe if I go back and look at clips from the films, I could see which ones you're talking about, but I don't even remember all the different replica biomes they went to in Retribution. I remember Japan and Moscow, and then they go outside the facility, fight each other on the ice, and where they were in Antarctica. But yeah, there's so much I've forgotten from the movies. It's like not even funny. Because part of it is that they got so hard to follow, not just with the retcons, but with how stupidly convoluted they made everything. And it's like so much of that would have been completely avoidable if they had some kind of even just a rough plan for what they wanted to do with these films. Like if they planned ahead a little bit more for, okay, if this first film succeeds, then what are we going to do with a second, a third? But Paul Anderson was already writing the second one, or ideas for what would become the second one, by the time the first film had come out. So, that was before they even knew if they were going to make a sequel or not, or if it was going to be greenlit. So if you had that kind of foresight for all 6 movies, then, hell, maybe a lot of these retcons could have been avoided. But I really don't know what Capcom's thought process was with that. How much attention they were paying to the development of the films alongside the games.
Oh, it was correction on my part. So in Retribution, those were the twin zombie axemen with the executioners wielding axes. That's why for some reason I thought that they were supposed to be tyrants. So that was a correction right there.
I totally forgot that the executioners came back in Retribution. Like, I knew there was that one in Afterlife that was there for some reason that's never explained. Like it doesn't look like it would belong in that environment at all, and it's like it randomly shows up. Like, I guess Wesker just dropped it off of the Arcadia, the ship, to go and harass Alice, or I guess he wanted another. He sends so many of these monsters basically get sent out to either test Alice or try to kill her. And it's like at a certain point, I'm just like, where are all these guys even coming from? Usually with these monsters, they fit their costumes are designed with a theme in mind within the context of the game they're appearing in. So it's like the Executioner showing up in Resident Evil 5. In that environment, his design, I guess you could argue, makes a little more sense. Same thing with, the chainsaw zombies that appear in 5 and 4. But you drop him in the middle of Afterlife, and it's like so often they do these things with iconic monsters from the games. And I'm just like, what? Was there any thought given to how you would work this guy into the script? Or is this just pure fan service, like you have to fulfill a mandate or something? I don't know. I don't know if there was like a specific diversity of monster budget or fan service quota that had to be met for each of these movies to get Capcom's green light or something.
Well, I was going to say the Executioner sort of reminded me something out of Resident Evil. Out of Silent Hill, excuse me. Sorry, no, but it does like Silent Hill. Yeah. Like it looked like it was one of the monsters from Silent Hill, and I don't know like how much of a creativity they took there to mimic that.
Pyramid Head, right?
Yes.
Hey, that would make for an excellent death battle. Yeah, there's just, like I said, there's just so much about the history of the first Resident Evil movie that I don't think we'll ever know unless it comes straight from the mouths of people who were there at the time. I mean, I don't even know how many people in Capcom are still working there that were involved with the project at this point. You're talking 97, 2007, 17. It's getting close to almost 30 years ago now. God, I feel my age, but one thing I've always found kind of sweet about these films, despite my love-hate relationship with them, is the first one is where, Paul W.S. Anderson, he finally gets approached after, the however many directors and writers Capcom went through rejecting for who they wanted to helm this damn thing. And apparently, allegedly, Paul Anderson was already making a movie that was basically Resident Evil in everything but name, because he was already a fan of it. This is a prime example of why fans of the source material are not inherently or by default the best qualified people to helm these projects. I mean, I do think it's important you at least respect the material you're working with, even if you personally, don't like it. But if you dislike it so strongly that you just you openly hate it, like the people that wrote, Netflix's Witcher, then it's like at that point you shouldn't even be doing the thing to begin with. But there is definitely a gray area between. I mean, Christoph Gans was a big Silent Hill fan, before they brought him on to make the 2006 movie. And I would argue, in retrospect, he was probably one of the worst choices possible to do a Silent Hill movie, with how little he understood about it. But all that aside, this is where Anderson comes in, and he was making basically his own Resident Evil kind of movie, just without the title. And Capcom approached him to retool his idea into a script for an official adaptation. So I don't know exactly how much of the first Resident Evil movie is from the retooling versus how much of it was the script that he was already working on making before it became a Resident Evil film. But, wherever one ends and the other begins, that explains a lot of why the first film feels so divorced from the games, in terms of just how different it looks and the type of tone that it had. Because it really does feel a lot more like a Paul Anderson film, like a personal film for him, than it does a Resident Evil adaptation, in my opinion. But the first film is where he met Mila Jovovich, and that was the beginning of their relationship that would progress to marriage. They got married in 2009, I feel kind of sorry for Jovovich's career post Resident Evil, because she really got pigeonholed into this series, much like Daniel Radcliffe did with Harry Potter. Or the retrospective that I watched on YouTube said that she basically got Marvelized before Marvelizing was a thing with the MCU actors. But yeah, she was an established actor at this point. She'd done like several films. Her breakout role was in The Fifth Element, if I remember right. And I loved that movie growing up. And that it came out in 96 or 95, like around the same time, I think, that the first Resident Evil game did. And she went on to this project, this series, because she and her brother were already big fans of the games. So it's like you can watch interviews of her talking like, oh, she thought this would score her a lot of big sister points, with her brother, like, hey, Big Sis is the main lead in the Resident Evil movies. So that is something I appreciate about her in these movies, is, coming into it as a fan and being so passionately committed to it from that mindset. It is. So I'm sure you probably know what I'm talking about when I talk about the style of these movies, right? Like the very specific tone that they have.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. So basically, depending on who you ask, it's the direction of the entire live-action RE franchise is owed chiefly to two decisions. One, firing George Romero.
You're a fucking idiot.
and 2, basing so much of this series, especially its style, off of the 2000s action subgenre that was popularized by The Matrix. Yeah, 1999, The Matrix, just that movie, which itself was largely inspired from anime like Ghost in the Shell and Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. And so there's really kind of a full circle relationship here in terms of, Japan influencing America and vice versa. There's the whole Resident Evil franchise, including the games, is kind of a blend of Japanese and Americana kind of blending together. But yeah, this whole stylized, action-heavy, very 2000s energy of the films was directly influenced by the Wachowski success with The Matrix. And this created a whole period of stylized action movies and video games, often with futuristic and or sci-fi settings that were shot and edited like music videos. You look at Aeon Flux, Ultraviolet, Underworld. And this could be a major reason why the Resident Evil games developed a heavier emphasis on action in later years, especially RE4. And that concludes the first episode for the second season of Horror Convos. Again, tune in next time for part 2 of this discussion between Alfonso and I. A big thanks to him for coming back to talk with me. In the meantime, comment below. Are you a Resident Evil fan? Did you get into the series through the games, movies, or perhaps other materials? What do you think about the films? Do you prefer the live action or animated ones? Don't be shy with those opinions. Remember, this is more than a podcast. It is a dialogue between horror lovers. Here is your regular reminder that Horror Convos is available to listen to on YouTube and Spotify. New episodes release every other Wednesday, so please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss when our newest content is uploaded. Until we talk again, good night, be well, and happy 2025.